For nearly 40 years, the file sat in a property and evidence room in Wenatchee, Washington. Pieces of cloth. Slides. Sealed bags. Things collected on a quiet morning in May 1986, behind a building most people in town walked past every day without thinking twice. The woman who was found there had a name, a family, and a face that her loved ones never stopped picturing. But she did not have a killer. Not officially. Not for 39 years. Detectives retired. New detectives took over. Some retired too. The case was reviewed, shelved, reviewed again. Witnesses moved away. Memories faded. The Stanley Civic Center kept opening its doors every morning, and almost nobody who passed the back lot remembered what had happened there. Then, in early 2025, a phone call came in from a state crime lab. A name. A man in Kamloops, British Columbia. A man who had died alone in the snow in 2007. A man whose face had appeared on a housing project sign in Canada because the community there believed he was a kind soul. That man, investigators now say, was the killer they had been searching for since 1986. And the only way they ever found him was because of one small sample of DNA, and a relative who had no idea what her brother had done. This is the story of how Carol Traicoff finally got an answer. Wenatchee, Washington, sits in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, surrounded by apple orchards and the slow, wide Columbia River. In the 1980s it was a small city, the kind of place where neighbors recognized each other at the grocery store and where the local newspaper still ran stories about high school sports on page 1. It was quiet. Working class. Mostly safe. But like every small city, it had a quieter underside. Around the downtown core, there were people who slept rough. People who drifted between Wenatchee and other towns along the river. Some of them gathered behind a building called the Stanley Civic Center, on North Wenatchee Avenue. Police would later describe that back lot as a known gathering place for members of the city's transient community. On May 14, 1986, officers with the Wenatchee Police Department were called to that exact spot. Behind the Stanley Center, they found the body of a 35-year-old woman. Her name was Carol A. Traicoff. She had been killed. Investigators classified her death as a homicidal assault. This is not a fictional story. Every detail you are about to hear is drawn from official statements by the Wenatchee Police Department, the Washington State Patrol, the forensic firm Othram, and reporting by KREM, King 5, CBC News, and other outlets. Some details are still unknown, and where that is true, we will say so honestly. What you are about to hear is the story of a case that almost vanished, a small city that refused to forget, and a piece of evidence from 1986 that was patient enough to wait for science to catch up. Carol Traicoff was 35 years old in May 1986. According to the Wenatchee Police Department, she would have been 75 years old today. That single sentence, repeated in nearly every news release about the case, says more than it seems. It tells you that her family was still counting her birthdays. Still imagining the woman she would have grown into. Still measuring the years that were taken from her. Much of Carol's daily life in 1986 remains private. Public records about her have been kept limited, partly out of respect for her family and partly because, in 1986, victims like Carol were not always given the long obituaries and detailed biographies that we expect today. What we do know comes mostly from police statements and local reporting. Sergeant Joe Eaton of the Wenatchee Police Department has said publicly that Carol, like the man eventually identified as her killer, lived what officers described as a transient lifestyle in Wenatchee. The back lot of the Stanley Civic Center, where she was found, was a place where people in similar situations sometimes gathered, slept, or passed through. That single fact has shaped how many people remember this case. It is also the reason her family has been so determined to make sure she is remembered as a person, not as a statistic. It is important here to slow down and say something clearly. People who live on the margins of a community are not invisible. They are not less. They are daughters, sisters, friends, mothers. They have voices, opinions, jokes, favorite foods, people who love them. The Wenatchee Police Department, in its public statements, has thanked Carol's family for, in their words, never giving up and remaining determined in their pursuit of justice for their loved one. That detail matters. It tells us that someone, somewhere, kept her photograph on a wall. Kept her name in their mouth. Kept asking questions long after most people in town had moved on. As you listen to this case, ask yourself, what would you have noticed first? A missing face from the usual spot near the Civic Center? A sudden quiet in a corner of town that was rarely quiet? Or would you, like so many people in 1986, have simply walked past, assuming the story behind the police tape did not belong to you? Carol Traicoff's story did belong to her town. And in the end, it took nearly 4 decades for her town to finish telling it. The exact hours of Carol Traicoff's last day are not fully public. Police have not released a detailed timeline of her movements on May 13 or in the early hours of May 14, 1986. What we know comes from the official statements of the Wenatchee Police Department and from news outlets reporting their words. On May 14, 1986, officers were dispatched to the area behind the Stanley Civic Center on North Wenatchee Avenue. Upon arrival, they found Carol deceased. The initial investigation revealed that she had been the victim of a homicide. According to Sergeant Eaton, Carol was found with blunt force trauma, and investigators believed the killing was sexually motivated. That is the documented core of what happened. Out of respect for Carol and her family, we are not going to embellish those moments. There is no need to. The facts themselves are heavy enough. What was the Stanley Civic Center, exactly? In 1986, it was a venue and meeting space near downtown Wenatchee. The building was active, but the back lot was a different world. It was tucked away. Less visible. The kind of place where a person could come and go without being noticed. Police described it as a gathering point for the local transient community. For investigators arriving that morning, the back lot would have been a difficult crime scene. Open. Exposed to weather. Frequented by many people coming and going. A place where physical evidence could be contaminated, trampled, or scattered. A place where any number of people might have crossed through in the hours before the body was found. The Wenatchee Police Department processed the scene thoroughly. Officers canvassed the surrounding area for witnesses and additional information. Evidence was collected and submitted to the FBI for forensic analysis. This was the standard, careful approach of the time. Photographs. Samples. Notes. Interviews with anyone who had been nearby. But this was 1986. DNA testing as we know it today did not yet exist for routine police work. The first criminal conviction in the United States using DNA evidence would not happen until the late 1980s. Forensic databases were primitive. Genetic genealogy as a field of investigation would not even be invented until decades later. The samples collected behind the Stanley Center could be looked at. They could be tested with the tools of the time. But they could not yet be made to speak. There were no immediate arrests. There was no clean suspect. There were witnesses to interview, leads to chase, theories to test, and somewhere out there, walking through his own life, was the man whose name would not be known for another 39 years. The detectives who stood in that back lot in May 1986 did not yet know that they had already collected the most important clue in the case. They had it in their hands. They sealed it into evidence bags. They labeled it. They stored it. And then they waited, without knowing they were waiting, for a future they could not yet imagine. In the weeks and months after May 14, 1986, the Wenatchee Police Department threw everything they had at Carol Traicoff's murder. According to the department's own later account, over the 2 years following her death, investigators pursued numerous leads, conducted multiple interviews. and administered several polygraph examinations. Polygraphs. Multiple ones. That single detail tells you how seriously the case was being worked. Detectives were not just collecting tips and filing them away. They were sitting people down. They were asking hard questions. They were measuring breath and pulse and skin. They were trying, person by person, to narrow the field of who might have been in that lot that night. Officers also worked the streets. They canvassed the area around the Stanley Center, talking to people who lived nearby, people who passed through, people who knew the rhythms of that part of town. They followed leads that crossed state lines. According to the Wenatchee Police Department's later statement, the investigation, even in the early years, spanned the country and extended into Canada. Think about that. In 1986, with no internet, no DNA database, no smartphones, no instant communication between agencies, Wenatchee detectives were already chasing leads that reached beyond their own state. Beyond their own country. They were doing the difficult, unglamorous work of cold calling, paper records, mailed photographs, and long-distance phone interviews. Evidence from the scene was sent to the FBI for forensic analysis. The FBI's lab at the time was among the most advanced in the world for its era, but its era was the mid-1980s. Hair comparison. Blood typing. Fiber analysis. Fingerprints. These were the tools. They were powerful, but they were limited. A blood type could narrow a suspect pool to millions of people. It could not pick out one man. According to Sergeant Joe Eaton of the Wenatchee Police Department, detectives at the time did not identify Henry Leland, the man now believed to be responsible, as a potential suspect. He was never interviewed. He was, in 1986, simply not on their radar. That detail is one of the most chilling in the entire case. It is not that police missed a clue about him. It is that there was no clue about him to miss. He lived elsewhere. He moved through life under no one's microscope. And in 1986, without DNA technology powerful enough to reach across a border and find him in a database, there was no way for any detective, no matter how skilled, to put a name to the unknown male whose biological evidence had been left at the scene. For 2 years, the leads kept coming. Then, slowly, they thinned. The phone calls dropped off. The local newspaper moved on to other stories. The detectives who had worked the case longest began to age out, retire, or get assigned to new cases. New homicides came in. The world kept turning. But what investigators didn't know was that the most important clue had already been found. It was in their own evidence room. It was sitting on a shelf. And it would still be sitting there, untouched but not forgotten, decades later. By the late 1980s, the active investigation into Carol Traicoff's murder had slowed to a quiet review. By the 1990s, it had cooled further. By the 2000s, it had become what every long-term homicide detective dreads and respects at the same time, a true cold case. The Wenatchee Police Department has been honest about this in its public statements. According to the department, since the initial investigation, numerous officers and detectives reviewed the case, but little to no new information was developed and no arrests were made. Imagine that, year after year. A new detective takes over the file. They open the box. They flip through the pages. They look at the photographs. They read the polygraph results. They look at the names of the people interviewed in 1986. Some of those people have moved. Some have died. Some have stopped talking to police entirely. There is no new technology yet to apply. There is no new witness on the horizon. So the detective closes the file, places it back on the shelf, and writes a short note saying that the review found nothing new. That cycle repeated for decades. Cold cases like this are not solved by magic. They are solved when something genuinely new becomes possible. In Carol's case, the limits were brutal and specific. The biological evidence collected in 1986 existed, but the science to interpret it fully did not. CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, was not operational until the 1990s. Genetic genealogy, the technique that would eventually crack the case, did not exist as an investigative tool until 2018, when it was first famously used to identify the Golden State Killer. There was also a quieter problem. Many of the people who might have known something in 1986 simply were not findable later. The Stanley Center back lot was a gathering place for people who moved often, who did not always have stable phone numbers, who sometimes used different names. Witnesses from that world are hard to reach in 1986. They become almost impossible to reach in 2010. And there was the emotional toll. The family of Carol Traicoff was carrying a weight that does not show up in case files. Holidays. Birthdays. Empty chairs at the table. The Wenatchee Police Department later thanked Carol's family for, quote, never giving up and remaining determined in their pursuit of justice for their loved one. That phrase points at decades of phone calls, anniversaries marked, hopes raised and lowered, and the long, exhausting work of refusing to let a name disappear. For years, the case files stayed quiet. Then one small piece of evidence changed everything. The turn came in January 2023. According to the Wenatchee Police Department, that is when then-Detective Sergeant Ryan Weatherman, now retired, began reviewing the case. He partnered with the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab and a forensic scientist identified in official statements as B. Wright. What they did next sounds simple, but it had taken almost 40 years to become possible. Weatherman pulled the evidence collected in 1986 out of storage and submitted it for further examination using modern testing methods. According to police, the new testing located DNA of an unknown male. Pause on that sentence. DNA of an unknown male. The samples that the FBI had looked at in 1986, with the limited tools of the time, had been holding that profile the entire time. For nearly 4 decades, the genetic fingerprint of the man who killed Carol Traicoff had been sitting in a Wenatchee evidence room, waiting for someone to ask it the right question. An STR profile, the standard kind of DNA profile used in modern crime labs, was developed and entered into CODIS. There was no match. The man had never had his DNA collected by U.S. authorities. He was not in the system. That could easily have been the end of the road. In an older era of cold case work, it often was. A profile with no match was just a number on a page. But by 2023, there was another option. Forensic genetic genealogy. Forensic genetic genealogy works like this. Investigators take a DNA sample and look not for an exact match in a police database, but for partial matches with people who have voluntarily submitted their DNA to public or law enforcement accessible genealogy databases. Cousins. Second cousins. Distant relatives. Then trained genealogists build out family trees from those matches, narrowing the possibilities until they can point at a small number of people who could plausibly have left the original sample. Weatherman worked with the Department of Justice and the Washington State Attorney General's office to secure funding for this kind of testing. Funding that, according to public statements from Othram, was made possible in part by Governor Ferguson, Attorney General Nick Brown, and the Washington State Legislature. In July 2024, the DNA was submitted, through the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, to a Texas-based forensic genetic genealogy company called Othram. Othram specializes in something called forensic-grade genome sequencing, which can build a much more detailed genetic profile from old, degraded biological evidence than standard methods can. Their team then runs that profile through genealogy searches and builds family trees. In December 2024, Othram reported its results to Wenatchee investigators. The genealogy work pointed to a possible family lineage spread across the United States and Canada. That detail is huge. The unknown male was no longer unknown in the way he used to be. He had a family tree. He had relatives who could be looked for. And, critically, that family tree had a strong Canadian branch. The DNA results were then submitted to Canada for comparison in its own national database, the equivalent of CODI's. And on February 24, 2025, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab reported back with a name. Henry B. Leland. A man who had lived for years on the streets of Kamloops, British Columbia. A man who, the lab said, was the source of the DNA collected in 1986 behind the Stanley Civic Center. The answer was not in a new witness. It was hidden in something collected decades earlier. For the first time since May 14, 1986, the Wenatchee Police Department was looking at the face, and the name, of the man they believed had killed Carol Traicoff. There would be no arrest. There would be no trial. There would be no perp walk, no televised verdict, no sentencing. That is because Henry Leland had been dead for nearly 18 years. According to the Wenatchee Police Department and reporting by CBC News, Leland died in December 2007 in Kamloops, British Columbia. He was unhoused at the time. Sergeant Joe Eaton has said that Leland was found outside in the snow. A 2009 BC Ministry of Housing and Social Development news release said he had died due to exposure. Before his death, Leland had spent years on the streets of Kamloops. He was, by many accounts, well known in that community. In 2009, 2 years after his death, the provincial government of British Columbia named a 28-unit supportive housing development in his honor, Henry Leland House. Operated by the Ask Wellness Society. At the time of its opening, the province said he was, in their words, regarded by the community as a kind soul. That description sits in painful tension with what investigators in Washington now say he did in May 1986. After receiving Leland's name from the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab in February 2025, Wenatchee detectives had one more step to take. They needed to be certain. According to the department's own statement, Detective Brian Hewitt conducted further investigation and identified Leland's sister, his only known living biological relative. She was located in Gold Bar, Washington, and agreed to assist. She provided a DNA sample. Her DNA was compared against the profile from the 1986 evidence. The comparison further confirmed that Henry B. Leland was the source of the unknown male DNA collected from the scene of Carol Traicoff's homicide. According to Sergeant Eaton, Leland's sister was cooperative. He has said publicly that she told investigators she was not surprised police suspected her brother, citing his aggressive behavior. Beyond that single, carefully worded statement, very little has been released about her, and that is appropriate. She is a private citizen who lost a brother and is now living with the knowledge that he is officially named as a killer. In its official statement, the Wenatchee Police Department wrote, based on the investigation, it is believed that on or around May 14, 1986, Henry B. Leland killed Carol Traicoff. There is no current evidence to suggest another suspect, and it is believed that Leland and Traicoff were alone at the time. The investigation was officially closed. Because Leland is deceased, there will be no criminal prosecution. There will be no chance for him to be questioned, to confess, to explain, or to defend himself. He cannot be cross-examined. He cannot be sentenced. The closure of the case is administrative and forensic, not judicial. For some families of cold case victims, that kind of resolution is incomplete. There is no day in court. There is no defendant in handcuffs. There is only a name, finally, after decades. The reaction in Kamloops has been quiet but striking. According to CBC News and City News Vancouver, Bob Hughes, the executive officer of Ask Wellness Society, told reporters that the sign reading Henry Leland House will be removed. Ask Wellness has begun consulting with local Indigenous elders, including the Tk'emlúps and Skitcheston First Nations, about renaming the building. Leland was an Indigenous man, and the organization said it wanted that decision to be made with care and community guidance. BC Housing said it would work with Ask Wellness on the path forward. In a single news cycle, a man who had been remembered in one place as a kind soul became, in another place, a closed homicide file. Both communities are now living with that contradiction. It is tempting to treat the Carol Traicoff case as a feel-good story about science. DNA wins. Cold case closed. Roll credits. But the truth is more complicated, and more important. The first thing this case matters for is the simple, stubborn principle that no victim should be forgotten. Carol Traicoff was a woman who, in life, may not have had the kind of resources or stable address that draws sustained public attention. The lot where she was found was not a glamorous place. The case did not have a famous suspect. By every cold mathematical measure of which cases get solved, hers had a low chance. It was solved anyway. Because detectives kept reviewing it. Because a state crime lab kept improving its tools. Because a forensic firm developed new sequencing methods. Because a state government found funding for forensic genetic genealogy. Because a sister in Gold Bar, Washington, agreed to help. And because Carol's family, in the words of the Wenatchee Police Department, never gave up. The second thing this case matters for is the power, and the limits, of forensic genetic genealogy. The same technology that found Henry Leland has been used in dozens of cases across the country. Including the identification of the suspect in the Golden State Killer case in 2018 and the resolution of more than 40 other Washington state cases through Othram alone. It works because millions of ordinary people have submitted their DNA to consumer genealogy services, and because some of those services allow law enforcement access. That raises real questions. About privacy. About consent. About what we owe each other when our family tree can become a tool to identify a stranger's killer. These are not questions with easy answers. The third thing this case matters for is what it tells us about cold cases in general. As of the announcement of Carol Traicoff's case, the Wenatchee Police Department was working with Othram on what was described as the 48th publicly announced case in Washington state alone where this kind of identity inference pipeline had been used. Behind every one of those numbers is a family that kept a photograph on the wall. A detective who refused to close a file. A piece of evidence, patient, waiting. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it is justice that simply takes the technology it needs, and the people who refuse to forget, to finally arrive. Carol Traicoff would have turned 75 years old around the time the Wenatchee Police Department announced her case was closed. She did not get those years. They were taken from her on or around May 14, 1986, in a backlot in a quiet Washington city, by a man whose name no one in her town would learn for almost 4 decades. The man identified as her killer, Henry B. Leland, will never face a courtroom. He died in 2007, alone in the snow on the streets of a Canadian city that once thought well enough of him to put his name on a building. 2 communities are now holding 2 very different memories of the same man. One is taking his name off a wall. The other is, at last, writing the truth into a closed file. Carol's family kept her name alive long enough for science to catch up to her case. That, more than any piece of technology, is what made this resolution possible. So here is the question we want to leave you with. Do you think genetic genealogy should be used in every unsolved murder case, no matter how old it is? Even when the suspect is likely dead? Even when there will never be a trial? Is a name enough for a family, or does justice require something more? Tell us in the comments. Tell us how you feel about Carol's case. Tell us about cold cases in your own region that you wish would get this kind of attention. And if you know someone who follows cold case investigations, share this video with them. The more people who know Carol Traicoff's name, the harder it will be for any future victim to be forgotten. Thank you for watching, and for listening carefully, all the way to the end.